This is Robert Kaplan from the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. This is a podcast series about great power rivalry in an age of global demons.
If Russia continues to interfere with our democracy, I'm prepared to take further actions to respond.
Cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion.
The United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength.
How will conflicts between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia interact with pandemics, climate change, massive cyber attacks, state failures, and other terrors of a global media age? You'll want to listen closely to the breaks because you might be one of the lucky listeners to receive my latest book, The Good American, The Epic Life of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian, as part of a giveaway. With me is Karim Sadjadpour, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. And he is arguably the number one expert on all things having to do with Iran in Washington, and has always had real penetrating insights. Welcome, Karim.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's great to be with you.
Let me get right into it. First of all, internally speaking, where is Iran headed over the next year or so and over the next 10 years, if what one can even think in those terms? Iran just inaugurated a new president. Is that significant? Does it make a difference? And where is society headed on a trajectory of, say, the next few years?
Well, Robert, the great North African philosopher Ibn Khaldun wrote many years ago, centuries ago, that empires are built and destroyed over 3 generations. The first generation, they build it. The second generation, preserve it. By the time it reaches the third generation, they're kind of palace-reared softies and they end up losing it. And if you look at many authoritarian regimes over the ages, lasting of 3 generations is a common thread, the Soviet Union being a very good example. And I would argue that the Islamic Republic of Iran is now entering its kind of second generation of revolutionary leaders. The first generation, obviously, it started with Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. The current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has been ruling the country since 1989. He's one of the longest serving autocrats in the world. And he's kind of the last of the Mohicans, the last of the first generation leaders. And we're now entering the second generation of revolutionary leaders. The new president of Iran is a guy called Ibrahim Raisi. He was 20 years old when the revolution happened. And I would argue that essentially the Islamic Republic of Iran, Henry Kissinger famously said years ago that Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause. And I would argue that they've already made that decision. They've decided to be a revolutionary cause more than nation state. Whenever they've been at a fork in the road and they have to decide whether to prioritize the national interests of Iran or the ideological prerogatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, they've always chosen the latter course. So it's my view that this is a system which really is going to be incapable of reforming into, for example, reforming along the lines of what China did in the 1970s to put their economic interests before the revolutionary ideology and open up to the world. My view is that indeed Iran is likely to follow the path of the Soviet Union, which is more ideology, doubling down on ideology, which can only be sustained with repression. And this is a system which has a lot of repression still within it. And I think that that can last perhaps for another generation, but it's not something which can last indefinitely.
I believe you had written that Iran internally is a country of South Koreans that happen to be governed by North Koreans. Is the divide between the regime and the vast percentage of the populace that wide? And is it more complex than that?
I'll say from the bat that Iran is a place which is inaccessible to many of us. I used to be based in Tehran and I was nearly imprisoned and I had to leave the country and I haven't been back since 2006. And so we do have to be very humble in trying to, taking the popular temperature of 82 million people from thousands of miles away. And I learned my lesson in 2016 as many of us did, even with all of our polling, very few people predicted that Donald Trump was going to be elected in the United States. So gauging Iranian public opinion is very difficult. But what I'd say is that we now have 42 years of this experiment of revolutionary ideology. And I would argue that it's had very few redeeming qualities for people. There's no political freedom in Iran. There's very little social freedom. And if there was no political freedom and little social freedom, and the regime was able to deliver for people economically, as China has for many of its people, then you'd say, well, the priority for most people is economic deliverance, and they can live without political and social freedoms. But the Islamic Republic has deprived people of political and social freedoms and also failed dramatically economically. So I would say that the vast majority of this fairly young Iranian society, as I'd argue, would aspire to be more like South Korea than they would like North Korea. Now, does that mean the regime has zero popular support? Of course not. I think there is a strong contingency which still very much supports the government. And I remember years ago, during the 2009 uprisings in Iran, the son of a very prominent cleric in Iran said to me something I'll never forget. He said, what matters most for governments like Iran is not the breadth of their popular support, but the depth of their supporters. What that means is that even if you only have 15% or 20% popular support, those are the 20% who are armed and organized and willing to kill and die in order to preserve their authority. That's much more important for the government than 70, 80% of people who may post negative things about the regime on social media. And so I think the Islamic Republic, and this is there's actually good academic scholarship about how revolutionary authoritarian regimes tend to be more enduring than just your run-of-the-mill dictatorship that doesn't have a revolutionary ideology, because there still is this powerful organizing principle. And in the case of Iran, you have this symbiosis between the clerical establishment and the supreme leader and the military establishment and the Revolutionary Guards, in that it's a relationship which is obviously politically beneficial for the clerical establishment, and it's economically beneficial for the military establishment.
I find it fascinating that Iran went from an organized autocracy under the Shah, literally within days or weeks at the maximum, to an organized autocracy under the mullahs. There was very little chaos in the Iranian Revolution, unlike in a number of major states of the Arab Spring. Camus had written a book, The Rebel, where he said the greatest risk of revolutions is chaos, and therefore a rebel really has to think hard. Yet Iran seems to have solved this dilemma. It's gone from one regime smoothly to another. Does this go back deeper into Persian culture? Does it have some contingencies that are specific to 1979?
Well, two things. Number one is that for me, one of the lines which has really stayed with me over the years, and it applies to so many things, whether it's the Arab uprisings or Iranian politics or frankly even American politics oftentimes, is the line from Yeats in his poem Second Coming. The best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And what we saw in Iran post-revolution is that there was wide unity from whether it was those who wanted to establish Islamic theocracy or Marxist, communist, nationalist intellectuals, and that all these groups opposed the Shah of Iran. They had little common vision about what is their end game. But once the Shah left the scene, the Khomeinis turned out to be most effective in their ruthlessness, and their convictions went all the way. And I think what also helped certainly entrench the Khomeinis' power was the Iran-Iraq War, because suddenly, you had foreign invasion, those internal divisions, which were still pretty significant. The country became united around this common threat against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And so this is, frankly, the argument that Iranian government officials make right now, which is that no one should oppose us, even if you're not happy with the system. If we go away, there's going to be chaos, there's going to be civil war, Iran will turn into Syria. And I know people who are, strong critics of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who are somewhat sympathetic to that argument. They fear that, as bad as this status quo system is, at least it's a leviathan, as Thomas Hobbes said, that they have control. And if the alternative to this is chaos, anarchy, civil war, then, better the devil we know.
When we come back, Karim and I will discuss the implications of popular uprisings in Iran.
This podcast is sponsored by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. Founded in 1955, FPRI is committed to producing the highest quality scholarship and expert analysis through the lens of history, geography, and culture. For more information about FPRI and our work to educate the public on the most pressing foreign policy issues of the day, please visit www.fpri.org.
We had, right before the COVID-19 explosion in early 2020, there were significant riots or at least demonstrations throughout Iran. Following that, the regime did not handle the original outbreak of COVID very well. It had some very embarrassing moments. Can demonstrations like this return in a post-COVID environment when people feel more comfortable to gather? And Iran has had big demonstrations before. How do you interpret the fact that there are periodic mass demonstrations, yet the regime is never in danger?
So there is widespread societal discontent in Iran. When I was based there for several years up until 2005-06, it was very uncommon to be able to encounter someone who would say, you know what, I'm happy with my life. The government is providing for us economically. I don't mind not having political and social freedoms. Corruption tends to anger people almost more than anything else when they see their government officials as being predatory. And we saw this in Afghanistan. This was one of the Achilles heels of the Afghan government, which helped, usher the return of the Taliban, this perception among Afghans that their government was very corrupt. And what I tell people is that in Iran, the corruption of the Islamic Republic is even more egregious in the eyes of people, because this is a regime which rules from a moral pedestal. It's a theocracy. And if you find out your priest or your imam or your rabbi is stealing from you, that's going to anger you a lot more than if your butcher is ripping you off. And so that is something which a lot of Iranians feel. And we have, over the last decades, had major popular unrest in Iran. What we haven't seen is the different social classes all revolting at the same time. There's been labor unrest, there's been student unrest. There have been times when it's middle class unrest and 2009 uprisings in Iran. You haven't had all that happen at the same time. I'd say 2 points. Number one is that what is unique about Iran in the Middle East is that most autocratic regimes in the Middle East, whether it's Sisi's Egypt or a lot of the Gulf monarchies, they are secular autocrats repressing primarily Islamist opposition. In Iran, you have the opposite dynamic. It's an Islamist autocracy which is primarily repressing secular opposition. The reason why I believe that's important is that you have a regime which still, frankly, they believe in martyrdom. They are willing to kill and die in order to maintain their hold on power. And you have a society which is not willing to get killed or kill in order to take power. One of the things I tell people is that in 1978, Iranians experienced a revolution without democracy. And today they aspire for democracy without a revolution. I would argue people have revolutionary ends, but they're not willing to pursue revolutionary means, as we've seen the Syrian people or the Yemeni people have. Now, one of the things I tell U.S. officials, during the Trump administration, there was this strategy of maximum pressure.
Yes.
And this belief that if only we just subject Iran to enormous popular pressure, that's going to spur people to rise up and overthrow the Islamic Republic. And what we actually see historically, and this is reflected in the academic research, is popular tumult and uprisings usually tend to happen not when people feel most destitute, but when people's expectations and their quality of life is starting to improve. Their expectations rise, but then those expectations are unfulfilled. This is oftentimes called the J-curve theory or revolution of rising expectations.
Yeah.
That's essentially what happened in Iran in 1979. It wasn't because people were destitute that they rose up against the Shah, but their lives were starting to improve. The Shah raised their expectations. Those expectations went unfulfilled. And so the reason why I say this is that I actually think that a restoral of the nuclear deal with Iran, which would remove the economic sanctions against Iran, in my view, that's not likely to entrench the Islamic Republic. That actually could cause more tumult for them, in that the pretext for Iran's economic failings will be removed because they'll no longer have the pretext of foreign sanctions. People's expectations will have risen. I would argue the Islamic Republic has no ability to really deliver for people economically. When your organizing principle is death to America and death to Israel, they don't really know how to manage a modern economy. And I think that after, when and if the nuclear deal is revived, they're not going to be able to fulfill economic expectations. Now, is that going to then culminate in a popular revolution? I don't think so, because of the dynamic I said earlier, which is you still have a regime and a military which is armed, organized, and willing to kill, and you have a society which is unarmed, unorganized, not willing to die.
Talking about U.S.-Iranian relations, in a previous article, Karim, you made a comparison, a metaphor between the approach that the U.S. took to the Soviet Union, George Kennan's containment idea, and how the U.S. should approach Iran, since it cannot topple the regime, but yet it opposes the regime at the same time. Can you walk me through that a bit?
We have to start with a realistic assessment about the nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we're now 42 years into this experiment. And because of Iran's inaccessibility, I don't think we have as good an understanding of the nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran as we did the nature of the Soviet Union 42 years into that experiment. And that there's been no US embassy in Tehran since 1979. It's very difficult for no US officials have visited Tehran. It's difficult for journalists to get to Iran. And I would argue there's been kind of three schools of thought with regards to Iran, kind of three metaphors which are commonly evoked. For years, it was the analogy of Nazi Germany, that Iran is like Hitler's Germany, and basically they can't be contained and they need to be dealt with forcefully. I would argue there's increasingly few people that are using that analogy. It used to be, Bibi Netanyahu of Israel using that analogy quite frequently, but we can throw that out the door. So second analogy, which has been commonly evoked, is to argue that Iran is like 1970s China. And it simply requires a very bold US gesture, just how Nixon went to China in order to have a grand bargain and a normalization between Tehran and Washington. I think this analogy is flawed because it doesn't understand how central Iran's hostility towards the United States is to its very identity as a regime. When you read Kissinger's book on China, he talks about how Mao was very clear in his belief that the mutual fears of the Soviet Union necessitated a US-China rapprochement. It was in China's national and security interest to normalize relations with the United States. That dynamic doesn't exist in the US-Iran context, in that for Ayatollah Khamenei, rapprochement with the United States poses far more of an existential threat to him than continued animosity towards the United States. The former president of Iran, Mohammad Khatami, once told me privately in a meeting in Oslo in 2008, he said, Mohammad Khatami said this to me, he said, when I was president, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, used to tell me that we need enmity with the United States. The revolution needs enmity with the United States. And so I think for that reason, my view is that the China analogy is a flawed one. And frankly, the China analogy was tested during the Obama years because you had President Obama writing multiple letters to the supreme leader, making it clear that The United States wanted to turn the page with Iran, Secretary of State John Kerry making that clear as well. And Iran didn't reciprocate. And frankly, now, if Iran was interested, the Biden administration is also interested in a better relationship with Iran, which Iran hasn't reciprocated. So I do think by default, the best analogy for Iran is that of the Soviet Union, meaning we can't make friends and we can't make amends with a regime which needs us as an adversary for their own internal legitimacy. But this is a system that can be contained until it eventually crumbles under the weight of its own internal contradictions and economic malaise. And there is no guarantee when that could happen. It's not something that we can control. There was a line from Mike McFaul, the former US ambassador to Russia, who said that it wasn't arms controllers that ended the Cold War. It was Russian Democrats who ended it. And I think likewise, it's not going to be nuclear negotiations who end the US-Iran Cold War. I think it's going to be Iranian, democracy agitators who eventually conclude it.
When we come back, Karim Sadjadpour and I will discuss the relationship between Iran and Russia, Iran and China, and what it all means for the United States.
If you're enjoying the Global Demons podcast, you'll also enjoy Robert D. Kaplan's latest book, The Good American, a sweeping yet intimate story of the most influential humanitarian you've never heard of, Bob Gersony, who spent 4 decades in crisis zones around the world. Thanks to our sponsor, Random House, you can win a signed copy of The Good American just by listening to this podcast. All you have to do is subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. We will have a random drawing and announce the winner on our 13th and final episode.
It doesn't befriend it, but it doesn't seek to overthrow it, and it just has to deal with it. Where does Iran stand vis-a-vis Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China? Describe to me for a minute or so or longer the dynamic between Iran and in Russia and Iran and China and what that means for the United States.
I really think that decades from now, we'll look back on this period as an historic anomaly, and that it is ahistoric that America and Iran are sworn adversaries, and Iran and Russia are perceived as allies or strategic partners. And that I would argue from the vantage point of Iranians, they actually view Russia in a much more negative light than the United States. And they believe that Russia actually, and I would argue this is accurate, that Russia really benefits from Iran's isolation, and that one of the few countries in the world that could really compete with Russia in European gas markets is Iran. Iran arguably has the 3rd largest reserves of natural gas in the world. And I don't think they're even in the top 15 or 20 exporters because they haven't managed to exploit the gas reserves the same way that, for example, Qatar and Russia has. So Russia benefits from Iran, which is isolated. It's not exploiting its gas reserves, its oil reserves. There's little competition from Iran towards Russia in Central Asia, which were historically places that Iran had enormous influence in, whether it's, Turkmenistan, Georgia, Tajikistan, because Iran is focused on the Middle East. Russia benefits from Iran playing a thorn in the side of the United States. I would argue for all these reasons, Russia has benefited from kind of Iran's status quo isolation, and it doesn't serve Russia's interest for Iran to emerge from isolation and start to really be able to exploit its natural resources and have better relations with the United States. Now, I would argue, despite the fact that China and Russia oftentimes vote together in international forums with regards to Iran, I would argue China has different interests vis-a-vis Iran, and that for China, the relationship with Iran is much more transactional. They import Iranian energy and they sell their products to Iran, and they want to play a role in, Iran figures prominently in China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that if China could push a button and the US and Iran were to normalize relations, and all of a sudden Iran's oil output were to double and its gas output were to triple, that would be totally fine with China. And Iran would open up sanctions would be lifted and far more opportunities for China to do business in Iran. So I do think that China and Russia have very different interests vis-a-vis Iran. At the moment, the Islamic Republic is heavily reliant on China, almost even more so than the Shah's government was reliant on the United States. And it's precisely because of the fact that China doesn't care about Iran's human rights record. They don't care how Iran treats its people. They don't give Iran a hard time for arming Hezbollah or Shia militias in Iraq, the same way that American Europeans care about that. And for that reason, we've obviously see Iran orienting itself eastward. And then, finally, like many authoritarian regimes, Iran has really benefited from China's know-how when it comes to digital surveillance and, more sophisticated use of repression.
This sounds fascinating. I vaguely recall, wasn't there a Russian ambassador in 19th century Iran under the Qajar dynasty who was lynched by an Iranian mob? Russia has a real history of unofficial imperialism and occupation towards Iran. It's proximate and therefore it's a threat, where the United States is half a world away and should not be a threat to an Indo-European civilization that is non-Arab.
That is absolutely right. And even more recently than that, in 1946, the Soviet Union occupied and tried to annex a chunk of northwestern Iran, Iranian Azerbaijan. And it was the United States under President Harry Truman which intervened to kick out the Soviets and restore Iranian sovereignty. And so I do think that the history of US-Iran relations has been very much politicized. I remember just before the pandemic, I was giving a talk at Berkeley, and there was probably 150 people in the audience. And I said, how many of you know what the United States did in Iran in 1953, which was, of course, the coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh, and every single hand went up in the room. And I said, well, how many of you know what the United States did in Iran in 1946, which, as I said, America restored Iran's sovereignty when the Soviet Union tried to annex a chunk of Iran.
And that was only 7 years before 1953.
Exactly.
Yeah.
7 years prior, and not a single hand went up.
Yeah.
And so I do think that in the eyes of many Iranian people, just on a very simple level, there are over 1 million Iranians who have done very well in the United States, and young Iranians, their dream for many of them still is to come and emigrate to the United States. There's few Iranians living in Russia, living the Russian dream, and few Iranians that aspire to go and make their lives in Russia.
Final question, Karim. You said that basically that China and Russia benefit from this, we'll call it a parenthesis in world strategic history. I would assume they benefit in this great power struggle with the United States because Iran is not likely to change. It's not likely to have a counter-revolution anytime soon.
Certainly, Moscow doesn't want to see political change in Iran, which would be a reflection of Iranian national interests, which is, I think that the Russians are pretty cognizant of the fact that, if there were to be representative government in Iran, there would be a realignment. And, death to America doesn't make sense as an organizing principle if you're trying to forward your country's economic and security interests. As I said, I think from the vantage point of the Chinese, they're more transactional and less ideological. So if you went to the Chinese and said, listen, would you support a scenario whereby America and Iran normalize relations and Iran suddenly was able to quadruple its oil exports and its gas exports, and sanctions would be removed, so it would be far more opportunities for Chinese companies to invest in Iran? I think that they would be okay with that outcome. So I think that for Russia, this is much more ideological. For China, it's more transactional.
This is Robert Kaplan with Karim Sadjadpour. Thank you so much, Karim, for this time explaining Iran.
Great to be with you, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Global Demons podcast, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts and visit our website at www.fpri.org For the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'm Robert D. Kaplan.